Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. Here's historian Dr. Bruce Venter.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bruce Venter, a trustee on the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. And our guest today is Dr. Russ Bellico. Russ is a summer resident of the area. He has a house in Hague. And then when it gets cold, he moves back to Massachusetts, western part of Massachusetts. It's still probably cold over there. But anyway, Russ is a well-known scholar of the history of this region. He has published a number of books, including Chronicles of Lake George, Chronicles of Lake Champlain. My favorite book that he's written, the Empires in the Mountains, about the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. So welcome to the podcast, Russ.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I remember recently having a discussion with you about the quote-unquote massacre at Fort William Henry. A number of years ago, a fellow named Ian Steele, who is a professor was a professor up in Canada, he came out with a book called Betrayals, and he thought that he had the answer to what happened at Fort William Henry after it was surrendered to the French. He basically tried to downplay the idea of a massacre based on the research that he did into records of people being ransomed and what have you. But I think you have a different opinion on it. I'd like you to tell our listeners about your theory of the massacre.
You know, Steele's book is an important book. He did a scholarly endeavor. But I did examine all of those sources and then some when I did Empires in the Mountains. Somewhat different viewpoint in terms of what you would call the aftermath of the surrender of Fort William Henry on August 9th, 1757. First of all, Steele's viewpoint is more of the Canadian viewpoint and a little more sympathetic view toward the Native Americans. There were about 1,800 Native Americans on this expedition with the French in 1757. They came from as far as the Mississippi Valley, the Great Lakes. Now, the reason was the French population was very small compared to the English population. The English colonists wanted land, and they were going to be taking Native American land. Whereas the French, in mid-century, 1750, were only about 55,000 in New France, today's Canada, where we were here in the English colonies, 1.2 million, and we wanted more land, and more colonists were coming over. The French really had a better relationship with the Native Americans, trading furs and such. They came to try to protect their lands further west from the English settlers. As a result of that, they did come on this expedition, but they did expect, as anyone that went to wars, even in the 20th century, they expected trophies of war and plunder. They were to go back to show their bravery by having possessions of the enemy. The honors of war, the settlement with the English by the French, they suggested that the Native Americans, agreed with the settlement. They would march out from Lake George to Fort Edward, the English and the provincial troops, with their baggage, with their arms, without ammunition, and one small cannon. Well, the Native Americans really acquiesced. They kind of listened, but they were going to listen to this. They actually got into the fort that very day, and they butchered some of the sick and wounded in Fort William Henry. They got in through the openings for the cannons. Unfortunately for them, they also butchered and scalped some of the sick, which had been sick with smallpox. By bringing those scalps to their villages, they spread smallpox. So that was just a byproduct of it. The people that marched out of the fort and surrendered on August 9th were marched to the entrenched camp. Now, the importance of the entrenched camp is that actually more of the troops, and there were only 2,372 British and provincial troops. The provincial troops were Americans. They were the colonists, the colonial troops. In fact, there were only about 500 troops in Fort William Henry during the siege. 3/4 of them were the provincials, the Americans. Most of the British troops were actually over where Fort George is, and that was a hastily built entrenched camp with logs and stones and 6 cannon. Well, they were marched over there after the surrender on August 9th, but that very afternoon, the Native Americans came over those barriers, plundered trophies of war, and so forth. The British and provincials were to march to Fort Edward that night, about midnight, but that was canceled by Montcalm because he realized the Native Americans were not in their camp. They were waiting on the road to, get a hold of the survivors and their possessions. So it was canceled. But early on the morning of August 10th, the next morning, as they started to line up to leave, the British and the provincial troops, the Native Americans, the indigenous allies of the French, scaled the breastworks and began to plunder once again. Also, they pulled out 17 wounded men from the huts and scalped them. So as they began to march out, the actual attacks had already occurred. The soldiers were urged to give up their arms and their clothes. The irony of this is that later provincial officers said that those that actually gave up and did not resist were the ones more likely to be killed.
You're really basing it more on contemporary sources in terms of the number of people who were dispatched by the allies of the French.
Yeah, I mean, by contemporary sources, I mean diaries of the people that were there, letters that were written by officers, including Major General Daniel Webb, who was in command of Fort Edward, who did not come to the aid of George Monroe, at Lake George, because his information, which was faulty, said the French had 11,000 troops. In fact, they had about 8,000. We had these kinds of sources, including a lot of colonial newspapers. When I did Empires, I searched all of the colonial newspapers from 1754 through about 1760 for anything that had to do with the campaigns along the Hudson River, Lake George, and Lake Champlain.
So Russ Bellico feels as though it was a bona fide massacre. Would that be the bottom line?
Well, yes, Bruce, let me explain. There were multiple diaries that used the word massacre. So the word massacre was not invented, as Steele suggests in his book. It was in the newspaper articles. It was in actual General Webb's letter. He used the word butchered in his letter. A French captain used the word butchery and massacre, and he was an eyewitness to this. And as well as others, Colonel Angell from Rhode Island, he said a horrible scene of massacre. Many others. In the newspaper stories, yeah, maybe they were a little exaggerated, I don't know, but they were in there, and there were other, diaries that said that some of the women and the children, their brains were dashed out against the stones and things like this.
Well, so this is probably a topic that we could continue to debate. This is great.
Yeah, Bruce, what I'm trying to say is that the people that were there called it a massacre. So who are we in the 20th century, 21st century now, to start saying, well, oh no, this really wasn't. The people that were there considered it that. And in 1760, 3 years later, when the last campaign on Lake Champlain began, Timothy Ruggrove, who was a brigadier general in charge of all the provincial forces, the rallying cry when he addressed those troops at Crown Point just before they left was, "Remember the massacre at Fort William Henry."
Wow,
this was the rallying cry all through the colonies.
That's right.
These were people that were there.
Yeah. Before we close out here today, I just want to make note that you were a moving force as a member and a trustee of the Alliance in getting the wonderful visitor center in the Lake George Park Commission building. And you worked tirelessly for years to get that accomplished. And I think you should take great credit for that.
Well, there were a lot of people that got it over the finish line, and a lot of people that contributed to it in the Alliance. I had some idea for it.
Yeah, you did.
Early.
I know you did. Yes, that's right. It was your.
There were a lot of people.
I'm going to give it as your idea.
Also, the Lake George Park Commission with Dave Wick. I give him the credit. He came up with the proposal to give us that part of the building when he sought the grant for the whole new building. So that there was a lot of people involved in this.
Well, you should be very proud, Russ, and we're happy that you're here in the summertime up at Hague to join in all the Alliance projects that we're working on. Even though you're not on the board anymore, you still show up and you're still going to lend us.
I'm on the curation committee.
You're on the curation. I know. That's the subject of another podcast. Interest. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Russ. You did a great job today, and I think people learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more information or to check out the latest podcast, go to lakegeorgebattlefield.org and listen live on Saturday mornings at 9:40 a.m. to Lake George Battlefield Moments on 93.5 Lake FM.